I just want to address that, is innovation dead in the camera industry? Let me back up a second and tell you why I'm bringing this up. Over the course of the last couple of weeks, Fuji and Sony both released cameras that are very expensive. Neither of them have IBIS, and in one of the cases, the Sony, some features were taken away from the camera. In that case, the tilting screen was removed, which is a very strange step for me. So in the video that I did about the Sony, we got a lot of comments like, oh, Sony used to be the leader, and now they're not doing innovation, they're just doing these crappy cameras, and that's not exactly the case. So if you weren't around when mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras showed up, you might not remember the fact that DSLRs had really hit a barrier where they could not do much more. The technology in both frames per second and focus in DSLRs really couldn't get much better because you were limited to do things in the time that the mirror flipped up and flipped back down again. And really, there's only so much you can do to make the mirror flip up and flip back down faster. Once you get there, everything else is going to be just a little bit of improvement in the camera body. And then full-frame mirrorless cameras came along, and Sony did the first generation of them, and the only benefit to those over a DSLR was that they were smaller and lighter. They could do a couple of things that DSLRs couldn't do. Video was one of the things that worked great with mirrorless cameras because with no mirror to have to raise up, you could just record to the sensor all the time and still do autofocus. But they were nowhere near as good as SLRs, and people were like, mirrorless cameras are never going to be the pro camera. In fact, mirrorless cameras at first were so far behind DSLRs that companies like Nikon and Canon said pretty much that they were never going to stop making DSLRs. They got really behind for years, but that's another video. So the state of photography at that point was that mirrorless cameras were around, but they weren't very good. And then the second generation and the third generation of mirrorless cameras started to come out, and they were on par with SLRs. And then the next generation of cameras came out, and they were better than SLR cameras, and that's when all the camera companies jumped on board and started to make them. The thing to remember about that is that there was so much headroom for this technology that every generation felt so much bigger. So you went from HD video to 4K video to 8K video, you went from 5 frames a second to 10 frames a second to 30 or 60. The technologies kept getting better and better. The sensors got better. They introduced backside illuminated sensors, which are really much better in low light. They introduced a global shutter on the Sony A9 III. The camera technology did have some very big leaps to it. So a lot of the prevailing thought is that the camera companies are just sitting around and they're only iterating a little bit each generation of the camera just in order to sell the same camera to a customer and not have to spend a lot of money on research and development. And that's not actually what's happening. A problem is that we're getting toward the end of what you can get out of a mirrorless sensor. So the addition over the last couple of years of subject detection autofocus really makes this point. Subject detection autofocus doesn't feel like it's a major jump over previous autofocus systems, but those systems with subject detection can be night and day over the previous systems. They are really, really good. And now everybody has those. That's a huge benefit that happened in the industry, but most people don't really think of that as innovation. But the ability to track the eye of a bird that's flying past you at 100 meters away, that is innovation. And then if you look at something like the Sony A9 III, which is the first full-frame global shutter, that is an amazing amount of engineering that has to go into that. Then if you look at Canon and Nikon, they started way behind Sony when it came to autofocus. Canon and Sony are now like this in some things and like that in some other things. You take a look at cameras like the Nikon series, and the Z5 II is like a little marvel. It's got all the features of a cine camera in a tiny, tiny body. So the camera companies are improving, but there is just less and less to do. So for example, there was news the other day that Sony is working on a triple layer sensor. Now, since Sony makes the sensors in almost all security cameras, this will likely end up there first, right? That triple layer sensor is supposed to be much faster in processing and low light, which is what security cameras really need. But just like the global shutter, which also started in security cameras, that will find its way to cameras, and that will be another big leap. Like the other thing is, where do you go at this point? When you look at something like the frame rate of a camera, 5 to 10 is a huge difference, right? 10 to 15 is a slightly less difference, but still really good. 15 to 30, that's a good difference, but now we have cameras that are doing 60 frames a second, 120 frames a second. Does anybody really need a 5,000 frames a second camera? I don't, and I don't think you do either. Another example of hitting the ceiling in technology is video. So the cameras originally could do 720, then they could do 1080, so HD, and then they got 4K, and now some of them have 8K, and the frame rates are up to 120 frames a second, 240 frames a second, second, and nobody's shooting above 8K right now. I mean, I'm sure some people are using RED and shooting at 12K or whatever and then cropping it down, but you and me are not shooting at 12K. Another thing we saw that was a huge jump was SD cards going to Compact Flash Express. The Type A that's in Sony, the Type B that's in most other cameras is much faster than what is in the cameras previously when they were only SD, and that will help with additional features for the cameras, but again, we're like running out of things that they can do. So again, to go back to the question, are camera companies just sitting back and selling people slight modifications and calling it a day? Are they just giving up on innovation? Well, to some degree, they are selling generations of cameras because people expect there to be new generations of cameras. So no, the innovation in camera companies isn't gone. Camera companies aren't just sitting on their butts trying to make more money off of you. We're just getting to diminishing returns on what can be done with the current technology. Will you and I see a brand new technology that completely changed the camera industry the way mirrorless did? Maybe, maybe not. But as it is right now, we're going to be seeing slower and slower innovation, but that's not the fault of the camera companies. That's just the fault of physics and demand for what customers are doing. So do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Is there anything that I forgot to cover in here or anywhere you think I'm just plain wrong? Let me know in the comments below. I read all of the comments and I reply to as many of them as I possibly can. For Imaging Resource, I'm editor David Schloss, and until next time, go out and give it your best shot.